Their journey ended aboard a lifeboat, but it began just before dawn, climbing into an overcrowded dinghy, and not all of them made it. 3 men, 1 woman, and a girl just 7 years old, the latest to die in the Channel, desperately trying to reach British shores. By the beach in northern France, where more than 100 people boarded the inflatable boat this morning,
Moi, je suis désolé, il y a un problème.
the local French mayor said the British plan to stop such tragedies won't work. I spoke to UK ministers, he said, and told them the Rwanda Bill, that's not going to change the situation. Not at all.
C'est pas ça qui va changer la donne, mais alors pas du tout.
Talking to troops in Poland, the Prime Minister said he fundamentally disagrees.
Incredibly sad to hear about the deaths in the Channel, and it just underscores how important it is that we stop these criminal gangs. And once we get the deterrent up and running, this will help us stop the boats. People need to know that if they come to our country illegally, they won't be able to stay.
2 years and countless arguments after Rwanda was ever first mentioned.
As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content. The contents have it.
It was with more of a whimper than a bang that the government's flagship law to tackle small boat crossings passed the House of Lords at 12:09 a.m.
Today is a landmark moment in our plan to stop the boats.
3 minutes later, the Home Secretary claimed victory on social media. The number of small boat crossings had been rising year on year until a peak in 2022. Last year, though, it dropped significantly, in large part due to striking a returns deal with Albania. But the downward trend has stopped. 6,265 people have already arrived in 2024, up 24% compared to the same period last year. The Rwanda Bill has still got to get royal assent, essentially being signed off by the King before it becomes law. At that point, the soonest planes could take off will be 12 days, but the Prime Minister has said he doesn't expect them to go for 10 to 12 weeks. In practice, we understand part of the reason is so that Home Office officials can sift through thousands of cases looking for the most watertight, those most able to stand up to legal challenge. Whisper it quietly, though, there is still a fear among many Tory backbenchers. What if this plan still doesn't work? Will you be helping people to fight relocation to Rwanda?
Yes, we will.
For charities and human rights lawyers, this policy is more rhetoric than reason. How much of a deterrent do you expect this legislation will be?
I think it's not going to be a deterrent at all. And when I go to Calais, they haven't heard about the Rwanda plan, most of them. Secondly, when they come across to the UK, they've been through some of the most traumatic experiences anyone can possibly imagine. So is the possibility that they may be one of the 300 we're hearing that go across inside a year, is that going to put them off? They'll take the risk.
Despite the £240 million already spent on this scheme, with commitments for over 100 million more, Labour say this plan only lasts as long as this government stays in power.
It's not a serious plan to tackle the dangerous boat crossings, and that's why Labour would replace it.
Sources on the south coast say they believe more than 300 people made this perilous crossing today. Thousands more may do the same before a single flight takes off. Thousands of more lives risked to reach these shores.
Paul McNamara reporting. Well, in a moment, we'll speak to the Conservative MP Richard Graham. But first, I'm joined by Zoe Gardner, who is a researcher and campaigner on migrants' rights. Thanks very much for coming to the studio, Zoe. The tragedy that we saw this morning, 7-year-old girl killed as well, is precisely the reason why the government wants to stop this and use the flights to Rwanda as a disincentive.
Well, the government says that it would do anything to stop people taking these risky journeys and to stop these deaths. But the one thing that it won't do is give people a safe alternative way to travel. And that's the one thing that would actually stop the deaths. We need to give people an alternative way to get across the Channel. We could then know who they are. We could give them an orderly paperwork in order to come here, and then put them into an orderly asylum system in order to assess their claim.
But that's not on the cards at the moment. And in the absence of that, is a robust disincentive not the second best idea?
But this isn't any kind of a disincentive. What we've
We
seen...
don't know yet, do we? I mean, the flights haven't taken off yet.
Well, all the evidence from similar types of schemes around the world tell us that this isn't going to be a disincentive. What it might do is push people into even more dangerous journeys, and I'll explain why. At the moment, even though it seems counterintuitive, the reason people are taking the small boats across the channel is because you're bound to be intercepted by the UK Border Force, who will take you into the system where you want to claim asylum, where you want to say, I'm a refugee, I need protection, let me stay. Now we're saying, we're not going to protect you. It doesn't matter who you are, man, woman, child, Afghan, Syrian.
Well, there are some exemptions, aren't there? So Afghans who served in the military, while we were there as well, they will be exempt from this, apparently.
Well, that's not been put into the legislation. And actually, I think that's kind of a workaround, because they know they're not going to send away even the tiny proportion of people. So they can argue, oh yeah, we'll keep the Afghans here. But in fact, they'd have to assess people to work out if they're Afghans, and we're not doing that.
There's still a possibility of specific legal challenges, aren't there? I mean, if there is serious and irreversible harm done by being sent to Rwanda, then there can be a challenge. How many people of those who are waiting, and we don't know the exact numbers, are kind of lining up to mount such a challenge? Do you have any idea?
I would imagine that lawyers and human rights defenders around the country are trying to identify the people who are most at risk of this in order to try to assist them. Because what will happen when we already know that everybody in the asylum system is now absolutely terrified that this might apply to them. And that's causing, these are people who are traumatized, who have escaped from war and persecution and undertaken really dangerous journeys. They've then been left in limbo with no right to work in squalid conditions in many cases for the long term. So their mental health has deteriorated further. And now they have this threat hanging over them as well. So in terms of people's mental health, we need to remember that this will be a violent operation, right? And so this is, in terms
violent because of the way that people have to be dragged onto planes.
They have to be dragged onto planes. People are likely to have serious mental health crises and panic attacks. They may attempt to self-harm. They may attempt to do desperate things in order to prevent themselves from being sent there. So the lawyers will try to use that to protect people.
Okay, Zoe Gardner, thanks very much. Let's turn to Richard Graham then. Richard Graham, thanks for coming on the programme. I mean, what you saw this morning is, I suppose you would say, another example of why we need to stop this trade. But I just wonder whether you're doing this or would say this out of compassion or because you think there are votes in it in the next election?
I've never approached this from a voting perspective. For me, it's a very practical issue, which is if we're going to do nothing to stop all these boats with illegal immigrants coming over to the UK, as some of the major parties would be quite happy to do, we are going to build up a huge problem for ourselves all across the country. And I know that personally as a constituency MP. We've had up to 500 asylum seekers living in Gloucester, and the strain on resources is considerable. And I don't think it's very good for those who are trying to come here either. So putting in place something which I think will be an effective deterrent, and I think, your previous guests, it's difficult to have it both ways. You can't on the one hand say this won't be any kind of deterrent and then say that there are asylum seekers here who are absolutely terrified of being taken to Rwanda.
We have been talking about this bill for a very long time now. I mean, it's been in the offing for 2 years. And we know that this year the number of people crossing is already 25% more than last year. So talk of Rwanda, which must be fairly unpleasant to those who want to seek asylum, certainly isn't a disincentive.
Well, that's partly because there are so many people out there who are saying this is never going to happen. It's not going to work. It won't be implemented. And of course, it is going to happen. The legislation is there. The agreement with Rwanda is there. The planes have been booked already. The people have largely been identified. So in a couple of months, we will see the first flights going. And it's not just going to be 150 people or 2 flights of 300. It'll be a series of flights over the next 5 years.
But the Rwandans have said they can only handle 200 people at the moment. I mean,
no, it hasn't. No, it hasn't.
The infrastructure is not ready to receive them at the other end.
No, it is there, Matt, and we've got MPs who've been out there and seen it, so you have to accept that it is there. And Rwanda has said this will be a regular number of flights over the next 5 years, as many people as we can send. So
at 11,000 quid a ticket, by the way. I mean, going first class on British Airways is cheaper.
What's happened with this whole Rwanda bill over time has been that everyone keeps finding a new reason as to why they believe it's not going to happen, and each time they've been proved wrong, and this will carry on happening.
But let me ask you this question, if I may, Richard Graham. I mean, we know that people are prepared to risk their lives, and sometimes they lose their lives in this perilous but relatively short journey across the Channel. If that's not a disincentive for them to come, why do you think a one-way ticket to Central Africa will be?
Because, and I've spoken to asylum seekers about this, if you're from a community, a family, a series of people helping to get together a large amount of money for you to be landed in a small boat in the UK, it is not part of the plan to end up in East Africa. If you're coming from the Middle East, that is not the destination that you're trying to get to. That's why Migration Watch and others say that this will act as a powerful deterrent. Now, none of us know for sure, but I think it is absolutely worth trying. And of course, no one else has come up with any alternative suggestion at all.
Well, that's it. That's for another day. If this doesn't work, what happens then? Richard Graham, got to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.